Okay, so we're going to be talking about some different examples of natural selection and how that has led to changes in real organisms and real evolution. So the first most classic example is the example of the peppered moth. The peppered moth has two phenotypes. It's got a white phenotype and a black phenotype. And where the peppered moth originally lived was in England, and England has a lot of trees that look kind of like this, a lot of deciduous trees. And here you can see in this video, in this picture, a black peppered moth on one of those trees and a white peppered moth, or actually you probably only see the black peppered moth. And that's really significant because you can imagine if you were a predator of the peppered moth, you're much more likely to see that black one and come swooping down to eat it than you are the white one. And so that means that the white peppered moth has greater fitness because it is more likely to survive in the environment and also therefore more likely to reproduce, because you can't reproduce if you've been eaten. Now, that led to a much higher population of white peppered moths than black peppered moths, but both still existed. Now, all of a sudden, humans come along and change the environment. And what humans did was they created all these factories in the Industrial Revolution. And these factories are pumping out smoke like crazy because all the factories were burning charcoal. And that charcoal soot deposited itself on the trees. And so the trees start to have this darker black color. Now, the black moths already existed. They weren't created by the fact that the trees were suddenly black. They were just sort of lucky. All of a sudden, the trees now match them. And so now, the black moths are the ones that have greater fitness. And the white moth is the one that you're going to eat. And so over the years during the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, we saw that the white moth got more and more rare, and the black moth got more and more common. And that, when you have an actual change in the percent of each genotype, is evolution. And we need to make sure that we understand these kinds of examples because it protects us against some of the major misconceptions about evolution. So I can give these examples as the theory of Lamarck, which was one of the early evolution pioneers. He first started talking about this. And his idea was generally based on the idea that organisms could change due to use and disuse. So he believed that the more you use a trait, the better it's going to become, and therefore the more advanced you will become at it. So he imagined, for example, a species of short-necked giraffes that was trying really, really, really hard to reach the top levels of trees. And so he believed that over their lifetimes, their necks would get a little bit longer. And that makes a little bit of sense. You can think about if you're an athlete and you use certain muscles, those muscles get stronger. Though I've been trying to get taller all my life and it's never really worked. So there do seem to be limits to that idea in reality. And then Lamarck believed that this sort of medium-necked giraffe would be able to pass his neck length onto the next generation, and they would be able to use their necks, and over time the necks would get longer and longer and longer. This is not how evolution works. This is a misconception. And the misconception is essentially that populations are the ones that evolve, not individuals. An individual giraffe is not able to change its genotype. Genotypes can only change over time from one generation to the next. So if you go back to the example of the peppered moth, a white moth is going to stay white its whole life, and a black moth is going to stay black its whole life. They're not going to change. But their children could change. The percentage of black moths in the next generation could be different than it was in the previous generation. And that's how evolution works. The other thing that's important to mention, and I tried to drive this home with the peppered moth also, is that the change in the phenotype is not caused by the environment. You don't have black moths suddenly appear because the environment, the trees, become darker in color. The black moths already existed in order to take advantage of that. Okay, so these changes in phenotype are not caused by the environment. They already existed. Now, the environment makes one phenotype better than another, but it doesn't create the different phenotypes. So you might wonder, if the environment doesn't create those different phenotypes, where do those phenotypes come from? Well, those phenotypes come from mutations. And a mutation is any random change in the genotype. So even though you got half your genes from your mom and half your genes from your dad, those genes are not actually exactly the same as the ones that your mom or your dad had. You have mutations in you. You are a mutant. And those mutations can usually be very simple. A great example of that is sickle cell anemia. So here is a normal red blood cell, and here is a sickle cell. These are both red blood cells, but this is a red blood cell for somebody who has sickle cell anemia. And you can tell it's called sickle cell because this has sort of a sickle shape. Sickle is most commonly the device used by the Grim Reaper. That's probably where you know it from because you're not farmers from the 15th century. Now, the sickle cell anemia mutation obviously has a big effect on the phenotype. The red blood cells look extremely different. But it comes from a very simple change in the genes. So here is a normal genetic code for the molecule hemoglobin. You can see the code right here, GTG, CAC, so on and so forth. Over here you have the mutant genotype, the mutant genetic code. The only difference is that this A right here is a T over here. This is just a single, what we call a point mutation. And that single piece of the genetic code being changed leads to a change in the sequence of the amino acids. You get a glutamine in the normal hemoglobin, and you have a valine in the mutant hemoglobin. Now, again, doesn't seem too important, except that when you look at the actual molecule as a whole, normal hemoglobin likes to kind of stay by itself, whereas mutant hemoglobin kind of sticks together and creates this elongated clump of hemoglobin, which stretches out the cell as a whole. And so it has to take this weird shape. Now you might be wondering, why does that even matter? Well, red blood cells have to squeeze through tiny blood vessels called capillaries. And a normal red blood cell is just the right size to squeeze through, one at a time, through a capillary. A sickle cell is a little bit too big to squeeze through easily. And so people with sickle cell anemia have poor circulation and poor blood flow, and that can be a problem. So we need to ask the question, is sickle cell anemia the kind of thing that's going to decrease fitness? Well, that depends, like we said, on the environment. If you live in a first world country, let's say, one that has very few diseases, so you live in the USA, sickle cell anemia is going to decrease your fitness. And the reason it's going to decrease your fitness is you're just not healthy. People with sickle cell anemia tend to feel very sick and weak and drained. So that can be a problem. It could affect your ability to reproduce. It might actually be completely neutral. People with sickle cell anemia may reproduce just as often as normal people. They might not feel great, but that doesn't necessarily mean they won't have kids. On the other hand, if you live in, South Africa or in Colombia or something like that, a more tropical area of the world, then you might have problems with the disease malaria. The interesting thing about sickle cell anemia is it provides malaria resistance. This cell actually is protected somewhat against malaria. And so if you live in a place with malaria, then you're going to want to have sickle cell anemia. It actually increases your fitness. So it all depends on the environment, whether a mutation is a good thing or a bad thing. Being a white peppered moth is good if there are white trees around, but it's bad if there are black trees around. And if the trees change, your fitness can change too. Another thing that can change fitness of organisms is human intervention. So a great example of this is coffee. We discovered, or Westerners discovered, coffee in Ethiopia, and they took it and spread it all around the world. So you've got this one plant that spreads all around the earth. And it's all basically versions of the exact same species spreading all around the earth. And it's really two different varieties. You've got Arabica, which is the most common, that tastes really good, and you got Robusta, which is actually pretty bitter and has a lot more caffeine. The Arabica breed, it turns out, even though it tastes really good, is not very hardy. But the majority of coffee plants in the world are all the same variety of Arabica. They're all clones of each other. And so that leads to a very low genetic variation in coffee plants. The problem with genetic variation is you're not likely to be able to survive if the environment changes. So one major change in the environment has been the introduction of this disease on the coffee plants called coffee rust. Coffee rust is a fungal infection. And in 2013, coffee rust in Guatemala took 70% of Guatemala's coffee production. Destroyed it, killed 70% of the plants. And this cost Guatemala $13.7 million just to keep all the farms still open by giving a little bit of money to people so they could make it through the year. A lot of people believe that if we were using a more varied coffee species, that we would actually have some varieties of coffee that are resistant to this coffee rust. Coffee Robusta, for example, is somewhat resistant to coffee rust. And so if we had higher genetic variation, our coffee might not taste as good, but it would certainly be able to survive, and we wouldn't throw away so much money on these things. Another example of this is human intervention with antibiotics. So if you've ever read the label on an antibiotic, you know that it is supposed to protect you against 99.9% of bacteria. Now you might wonder, what about that 0.1%? What's going on with those guys? Were they just hiding or something like that? Well, here's how it works. Let's say you've got all of these bacteria on you, and one of them has a mutation, and that mutation makes it resistant to antibiotics. Well, you use your antibiotic soap, and it kills all of these guys, except for this one, because he's resistant. Well, he goes on to create the next generation, and guess what? Most of his children are resistant to antibiotics. So the next time you use your soap, what happens to those guys? Nothing. They're perfectly happy being covered in antibiotics because they are resistant to it. Now, these mutations existed before antibiotics existed, but they weren't very competitive until we started using antibiotics. And the more we use antibiotics, the greater the fitness of these resistant organisms becomes, and so the more common they are. And this is a huge problem in emergency rooms today. Emergency rooms are becoming overwhelmed with bacterial infections that are resistant to antibiotics. And you know whose fault it is? It's ours, because we're using too many antibiotic products.